Good afternoon, and thank you all for being here. We're Team B, advocating for the U.S. to adopt a hawkish stance on the war in Ukraine. I'm Jason Shaw, and I'll be introducing our team, and we're honored to present our team's comprehensive strategy on Ukraine to an audience of distinguished military and security experts. My teammate, Elliot Louie, will be doing the military analysis, and my other teammate, Abby Furlanetto, will be taking over the economic analysis, and I will be concluding. In 1938, Neville Chamberlain described the signing of the Munich Agreement, which allowed Nazi Germany to annex the Sudetenland without resistance, as guaranteeing a peace with honor and a peace in our time. In doing so, he compromised the credibility of a united British-French deterrence strategy, and a year later, Hitler invaded Poland. Since then, the establishment of a rules-based international order produced a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. The credible threat of U.S. intervention underpins these rules, which encourages cooperation between our allies and deters our enemies from interfering. Putin is throwing the global security architecture into peril. He has staked the legitimacy of his regime on taking over Ukraine, and he has constantly shifted the reasons for invading from one fantastical reason to the next. Putin has called Zelensky an illegitimate leader, and he has argued that all of Ukraine is ours, and he has justified his invasion on the grounds of a farcical denazification campaign. Given these irrational reasons for invasion, negotiation is presently impossible. Russia's invasion directly assaults the post-World War II order that the U.S. has built: sovereign orders, peaceful dispute resolution, and international law. If Russia is allowed to gain or hold territory through force, it legitimizes revanchist aggression as a tool of statecraft. Drawing from Chamberlain's mistakes, our team is the team of no appeasement. Luckily, Russia is unambiguously weak, and a war in Ukraine is winnable. Several Russian economic sectors have collapsed by 90%, energy profits have halved, and the war has triggered a massive capital outflow. Militarily, the Russians are projected to run so low on tanks and munitions that it cannot maintain offensive operations beyond early 2026. Crucially, the more Russia struggles to outfit its soldiers with munitions, the more disposable it sees its soldiers, leading to a gradual diminishment of Russian combat capacity. Russian bids for peace presently only buy time for them to ramp up defense production and prolong a war of attrition. In a time where Trump has cast U.S. credibility into doubt, the U.S. must recommit to Ukraine militarily and economically. Our solutions are retaking the Donbas region up to the 2014 line, sanctioning the Russian economy, aiding the Ukrainian economy, and protecting Ukraine with eventual EU and NATO membership. First, by supporting Ukraine's expulsion of Russians within the 2014 line on the Eastern Front, the U.S. can demonstrate its commitment to Ukrainian sovereignty. This would enable pushing the Russians out of Zaporizhia, the Donbas, and Kherson. Arming and training Ukrainians can demonstrate our commitment to our allies without risking American servicemen. Additionally, Ukraine relies on energy infrastructure in Zaporizhia and the Donbas, which hosts most of its energy sector. For example, the Zaporizhia nuclear power plant, presently occupied by the Russians, produced 20% of Ukraine's total energy production alone. Furthermore, Russia has also occupied key ports and trade routes in the Black Sea, which is why Ukrainian grain exports have fallen to less than 1/3 of pre-war levels. Ukrainian ships have to hug the coastline of allied nations, which dramatically decreases export volume. Without the proposed regions, the Ukrainian economy, which is hugely dependent on the agricultural sector, could not stand by itself. Furthermore, to cripple the Russian economy's ability to support the war, the U.S. ought to increase our sanctioning efforts. The Russian economy is already weak because of the war, and additional sanctions on countries continuing to buy Russian oil would collapse the Russian war effort. The Ukrainian economy has devolved due to the flight of educated laborers and investment. Furthermore, the Russian military has purposefully targeted civil infrastructure such as power grids, sanitation, and gas distribution networks with the explicit purpose of making Ukraine uninhabitable for Ukrainians. The U.S. ought to invest in economic and humanitarian aid to keep Ukraine fighting during the war and stable after. To deter Russia from future incursions and to provide a foundation for rebuilding efforts, the US ought to facilitate Ukrainian entry into the NATO and EU fold. In the interim, the US ought to issue security guarantees to Ukraine and assist in the enhancement of the native Ukrainian defense industry. Presently, NATO membership is unlikely due to Ukraine's contested border, which is why bringing the war to an unambiguous victory is crucial for the eventual entry of Ukraine into NATO. NATO members recognize their shared interest with Ukraine. This is why recently they agreed to dedicate 5% of their national income on defense explicitly in response to Russian militarization. By draining the Russian military and entering Ukraine into NATO, the US can show that it is serious about making good on our end of the bargain. Our European allies can also help us foot the bill for the war. Ukraine's entry into the EU would allow it to receive various EU funds and programs for infrastructure development, agricultural support, and other areas, further aiding its modernization and development, which is crucial for its development after the war. It also increases Europe's financial interest in Ukrainian independence. We are on the side of no appeasement. We believe continued military pressure will force Putin to accept our terms completely. More importantly, Ukraine, supported by the US, would enhance the current European security architecture America has set up. By making Russia incur a cost of invasion now, this sends a message to Ukraine and other allies that they reap massive benefits in coordinating with other NATO countries. Supporting the war in Ukraine would lend legitimacy to the political normative framework of the alliance and would allow the world leaders to see their interests reflected in mutual rather than solitary defense. Elliot is going to explain why war is winnable for the United States.
My name is Elliot Louie, and I will be discussing American military policy in Europe. Since 1945, Europe has enjoyed a period of unprecedented peace and prosperity. However, in 2022, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, the European order was threatened. America has led the Western response to this crisis, making good on our steadfast commitments to Ukrainian territorial integrity and European security. We believe that without American leadership on the continent, there runs a significant risk of further Russian aggression and the deterioration of European alliances. Russia cannot be contained by peace talks or appeasement, only by stalwart opposition to their invasion. The United States needs to demonstrate, both to Russia and our allies, that we are here to stay in Europe. Although we recognize that territorial integrity is a fundamental norm of the post-war order, we do not believe that it is in Ukraine's best interest to pursue the liberation of Crimea at this moment. It would simply be a bridge too far. We are, however, committed to seeing the Donbass return to Ukraine, as well as the illegally annexed Kherson and Zaporizhia oblasts. As a matter of law and policy, the United States will continue to recognize Ukraine's rightful borders, which were repeatedly affirmed by both Russia and the United States before the beginning of the war. It is not enough to shore up Ukrainian defense in 2025 and 2026. Without a long-term commitment to Ukraine, the same threats that terrorize the country will continue. First, the United States should sign a 10-year Memorandum of Understanding with Ukraine, modeled after the American-Israeli relationship. This document, combined with congressional affirmation, will allow Ukraine to buy billions of dollars of American arms. Like Israel, Ukraine should be allowed to use American grants to buy arms from their own domestic manufacturers. Once Russian forces have been pushed out of Ukraine, preventing a second invasion is paramount. Ukraine should be integrated into NATO through a membership action plan until they can be accepted by the alliance as a full partner. Only by making good on our 2008 promise to Ukraine of NATO membership can we resolve the question of Ukrainian security. The United States will not allow the alliance to close its door in Ukraine's face. Until Ukraine is able to enter NATO, the US should sign a mutual defense pact with the country, promising to come to their aid if attacked. The return of war in Europe proves that NATO's initial task, keeping Russia out of Europe, is just as important today as it was during the Cold War. Our European allies have now finally woken up to this reality, committing to spending 5% of GDP on defense at the alliance's most recent summit. This was a great victory for European security and was long overdue. These changes do not, however, mean that it is time for America to take the back seat. The United States has a vital role to play in maintaining the European security architecture. Without the United States, NATO lacks the tools necessary to maintain their military edge, like air-to-air refueling and high-altitude air defense. The United Kingdom and France, Western Europe's only nuclear powers, both lack the nuclear triad, a crucial tool to maintain second strike capability. Neither country can sufficiently provide extended deterrence, the nuclear umbrella sheltering our NATO allies from Russian aggression. Russia believes that they can outlast the West, slowly degrading the Ukrainian military as Western aid slows, with the ultimate goal of conquering Ukraine. An American declaration to stay committed to Ukraine for as long as it takes is needed to change Putin's calculus and create the conditions for Ukrainian victory. This victory is not as improbable as many believe. Russia's military has consistently underperformed, and their casualties continue to grow. Russian Ministry of Labor data showed a 53% increase in the number of prosthetics distributed in 2024, and Moscow-based newspaper Kommersant reports that the country's funeral industry is booming. Some estimates put Russian casualties at nearly 1 million, and deaths as high as 250,000. The enormity of these losses cannot be understated. In just 3 years, Ukraine has inflicted nearly 5 times more military deaths than the US suffered in 11 years of war in Vietnam. Russia has failed to capture any major Ukrainian cities since summer of 2022, and despite the tiny size of Ukraine's navy, the country has managed to damage or destroy almost half of Russia's Black Sea warships. Winning the war outright is now a real possibility for Ukraine, given sufficient support from its Western allies. The path to victory will not be easy, but Ukraine is committed to this fight. All they need is our help. To this end, the United States should provide Ukraine with more military advisors who will provide a clearer picture of Ukraine's needs to Washington, train Ukrainian soldiers, and ensure the proper allocation of American aid. We should also send a Patriot system to Kiev to shelter the city from Russian ballistic missiles and drones. This would free up invaluable Ukrainian resources and manpower, allowing them to look eastward. Letting Ukraine use their F-16s effectively is key to any successful operation. Providing Ukraine with the advanced precision kill weapon system, a special laser guidance tool, will allow Ukrainian pilots to shoot down more drones for a significantly reduced price. There is a desperate need to train more Ukrainian pilots, and the US has a major role to play in this task. Bringing Ukrainian undergraduates to American pilot training as exchange students will reduce training time and increase interoperability in the long run. In the short term, expanding the size of existing American and European pilot training for Ukrainians is crucial. Ukraine's F-16s are key to their ability to hold Russian assets at risk. Without them, Ukraine has very little credible deterrence. To cut through the lengthy approval pipeline for jets, the US can provide F-16s to Ukraine directly, which combined with transfers from NATO countries phasing out the jet, will put Ukraine one step closer to air supremacy, and with it, winning the war. However, these changes by themselves will not be enough to shift the balance of war in Ukraine's favor. Without serious investment in America's defense industrial base, our ability to support Ukraine in the long term is exceptionally limited. The United States is now producing roughly 40,000 155mm artillery shells a month, nearly triple since the beginning of the war, but a far cry from the 250,000 a month that Ukraine would need to sustain a major offensive. We desperately need to invest in existing production lines to meet Ukraine's short-term needs, and to build new manufacturing plants to prepare for what will likely be a grueling campaign to reclaim occupied Ukrainian territory. Only by opening new plants and setting aggressive production targets can we give Ukraine the opportunity to win this war. Similarly, Ukraine needs many more of America's weapons systems. The Javelin missile, which the national interest dubbed Russia's worst nightmare, and the Ukrainians call Saint Javelin, is the country's most effective anti-tank weapon. Weighing only 50 pounds, the Javelin is exceptionally portable and able to be shoulder-fired. However, producing the Javelin is one of the most time-intensive tasks in defense manufacturing, making it impossible to adjust production based on battlefield conditions. For this reason, and to replenish depleted American stocks, we should seek to double our production of Javelin missiles to 2,800 by the end of 2026. We believe that these policies will shift the conditions on the battlefield, allowing Ukraine to recapture much of the territory that they've lost since 2014. Only once the Russian invasion is repelled can we go about creating a secure future for Ukraine. However, it is not enough to fight Russia on the battlefield. In order to achieve Ukrainian war aims, the United States needs to implement an aggressive and broad set of policies to strengthen Ukraine and undermine Russia's capacity to continue the war. I will now turn it over to Abby Frolinetto to present our economic strategy.
I'm Abby Frolinetto, and I will be putting forward our economic goals in Ukraine. The economic side of this war is as important as the military aspect. Together, the United States, Europe, and Ukraine have a massive economic edge over Russia, and it is critical that we use this power to our advantage. Economically, we have two aims: fracture Russia's economy and bolster the Ukrainian economy for both short and long-term prosperity. The United States has been key in providing aid to the war in Ukraine thus far. According to the Council on Foreign Relations, 0.5% of U.S. GDP is going to Ukraine's war effort. This is equivalent to $138 billion. We have a massive economy, so what is being sent to Ukraine, while very large and impactful to them, is a drop in the bucket for our nation. As you can see in the graph, the U.S. sent $61 billion in aid to Ukraine during fiscal year 2024. To put that in perspective, this amount is comparable to the $60 billion we spent on highway signage and architecture domestically. As the defenders of a successful, organized, and economically stable Europe, the U.S. needs to continue being the largest spender on Ukrainian defense throughout this conflict. Again, our strategy for providing economic aid falls into two categories: what we do against Russia's economy and what we do to bolster Ukraine's economy. As for Russia, they currently have a very weak economy. It is smaller than Italy's, with Italy's GDP being about $2.3 trillion and Russia's GDP being only $2.02 trillion. Currently, Russia's economy is largely driven by their war effort. In 2025, 40% of Russian federal expenditures are predicted to go to defense and national security. For comparison, the U.S. has averaged 15% for the last decade, and the U.S. already has a much larger economy. Additionally, Russia has a large dependence on their oil and gas markets. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies, if Russia faces additional sanctions, or the current ones are more effectively enforced, the Russian economy will be further constrained as revenues contract and spending faces more trade-offs. We can pressure Russia's economy further by imposing additional sanctions and more rigorously enforcing earlier sanctions. It is true that sanctions have not impacted Russia as much as they were hoped to, as the country is able to evade them via sales to India and China and their shadow fleet of unregistered vessels that they use to export goods. However, that does not mean that these sanctions have not proved at least impactful on Russia, causing disruptions. Thus, we propose more severe sanctions against Russia. As shown in this graph, while Russian oil imports in the U.S. and EU have decreased, China and India have increased their imports, effectively allowing Russia to bypass Western sanctions. We hope to cut off this problem using secondary sanctions. In agreement with the proposed Sanctioning Russia Act of 2025, we will impose 500% tariffs on Chinese and Indian imports should they continue to purchase Russian oil and gas. This tariff revenue can be used to provide aid funding to Ukraine. We also propose secondary sanctions on any bank that finances Russian oil and gas transport. Finally, we want to allocate funds to naval tracking and blocking of shadow fleet tankers via satellite enforcement and insurance bans on ships carrying Russian oil. We are also willing to send more American gas and oil to Europe to help offset the continent's reliance on Russian petroleum products. With aggressive and strategic sanctions, we can cripple Russia's economy. As our economic policy has two prongs, we now shift our focus to the means with which we aim to aid Ukraine financially. We propose sending economic aid to Ukraine with the goal of both strengthening their military offensive against Russia and helping to rebuild their economy and infrastructure. We propose a 0.5% increase in U.S. GDP going to Ukraine, putting 1% of U.S. GDP towards the war. This would equal $277 billion. Yes, this is a large number and a large increase from current spending. However, it is imperative that we provide these funds as they will drastically help Ukraine. From financing their military to providing aid within Ukraine, funding is critical and money well spent. Remember, this is the country where we once spent $43 million on a gas station in Afghanistan. So we've got the budget range to fund Ukraine. This increase in aid would be strategic, manageable, and yield a high return. Specifically, we will send 55% of our aid, or $152 billion, to military aid, including weapons, training, cyber defense, and logistics. 25% of our aid, or $69 billion, will go to reconstruction, including things like bridges, power, and transit. 10%, or $28 billion, will go to humanitarian aid, including medical services, food, shelter, and refugee support. Finally, the remaining 10% will go towards governance and operational tasks, like anti-corruption, democratic institutions, and fund management. We also expect our European allies to contribute financially to Ukraine's efforts. It is estimated that Ukraine will need $524 billion over the next decade to recover and rebuild from Russia's invasion. We will help fund that process through channels previously described, like U.S. spending and tariff revenue, but we also plan to use the $330 billion of frozen Russian assets to aid in alleviating the financial burden on Ukraine. Again, this action will be provocative, but it is necessary. Russia needs to be shown that naked aggression will not be tolerated, and using seized assets will demonstrate that the United States will not let Russia get away with its actions. Russia caused the damage to Ukraine, so it is only right that they pay to fix it. Over the long term, using these funds will make the rebuilding cost neutral to the U.S. taxpayer and ensure minimal to no financial strain placed on our citizens. The burden will fall on Russia itself. Additionally, we plan to guarantee long-term economic stability for Ukraine by adding it to the European Union. U.S. funding for governance, anti-corruption, and economic rebuilding directly prepares Ukraine to meet EU accession criteria. Once Ukraine is eligible to join the EU, and does so, it will have access to a number of EU benefits, guaranteeing its long-term economic stability and growth and helping to rebuild it and protect it from future aggressors. Specifically, full membership will allow Ukraine to trade tariff-free with 27 EU countries, massively boosting exports. Additionally, Ukraine will become eligible for billions of euros in development funding, aimed at modernizing roads, schools, and hospitals. EU membership will also help integrate Ukraine with the Western world, as the more Ukraine aligns with EU norms and institutions, the stronger its ties with NATO, the G7, and U.S. trade partners are. EU membership signals political stability and rule of law, attracting Western investors, which is essential for rebuilding Ukraine's infrastructure energy grid, and industrial base. Another benefit for supporting Ukraine's economy is the long-term payoff to the United States through natural resources. As demonstrated in this map, Ukraine has many deposits of lithium, titanium, zirconium, graphite, and rare earth minerals. In fact, it claims to have $15 trillion worth of these minerals. And more importantly, it already has much of the infrastructure to harvest these resources built. In spring 2025, President Trump signed a deal with Ukraine, creating a joint investment fund for the reconstruction of Ukraine. This fund is partly funded by revenues from future natural resource extraction, and it prioritizes U.S. access to Ukrainian minerals during reconstruction. Ultimately, wars are won through financing. The United States, paired with Ukraine and its European allies, can easily outspend Russia. It is critical that we use this to our advantage. We must cripple Russia's already weak economy with both new sanctions and more vigorous enforcement of old sanctions. We must aid the Ukrainian economy in both financing current war efforts and in ensuring long-term economic stability. These two facets of our economic proposal will help Ukraine win against Russia. I will now turn it over to my colleague Jason Shaw to conclude our proposal.
This war is not only a fight over land, it is a fight over the future of the global order. If Russia is allowed to rewrite borders by force, if dictators can shatter sovereign nations and face no consequences, then the rules-based international order that the US has built after 1945 begins to collapse. And as we saw in 1938, appeasement is not peace, it is surrender disguised as diplomacy. And today, we are the team of no appeasement. Victory in Ukraine is within reach, but only if the United States leads. Throughout our proposal, we have laid out a comprehensive roadmap for achieving this victory through military, economic, and political measures that together will secure Ukraine's freedom and America's credibility. Militarily, we have called for a surge in U.S. support, not boots on the ground, but smart, targeted investments that shift the balance on the battlefield. This includes supplying Ukraine with advanced arms, protecting Ukraine from missiles, and training Ukrainian pilots and officers. Economically, we leverage the full might of the U.S. and allied economies to both cripple Russia's war machine and rebuild Ukraine as a strong partner. Through targeting Russia's economy through secondary sanctions, freezing Russian central bank assets to be repurposed for Ukraine's reconstruction, and committing to long-term rebuilding. Politically, we outlined a path to permanent Ukrainian security through a U.S.-Ukraine Memorandum of Understanding, a mutual defense pact, and support for Ukrainian entrance into NATO. If we walk away now, we signal to our adversaries that our commitments are hollow. The United States and its allies have the tools to win this war. Russia is bleeding economically, isolated diplomatically, and degraded militarily. And by winning the war and integrating Ukraine into NATO and the EU, we prove that the political normative security architecture can preserve order in Europe. Thank you.
I haven't gone first yet, so I'll go first now. First of all, thank you for a very, very strong presentation. I thought it was well-researched and very articulate, very confident, and the slides were quite effective, I thought. So good job overall. I am actually quite sympathetic to many of your arguments and claims, but I'm going to push you on a couple of them. One thing that I worried about a little bit was I didn't hear anything about diplomacy or the role potentially for diplomacy. You've sort of gone right to the idea that you can win, or that Ukraine can win a war, win this war with Russia. So I'm going to, first of all, start to get you thinking about what you mean by win, and I'm going to cede my time to Steve because I know he's going to follow up on that. That's a big issue in his mind right now. But I guess coming back to diplomacy, you seem to be linking it solely with appeasement. And I think maybe that's problematic in a sense, because if you look at all of diplomacy as appeasement, you're cutting yourself off from some potentially very useful tools that I think you could rely on more effectively. And the one bit of what sounded like the political strategy for a diplomatic strategy was going to look very assertive and aggressive to Russia, which is EU membership plus NATO membership. So those are things I'm a little bit worried about. The other thing is, again, in strategy, everything is a trade-off. So you have this theater to worry about, but you have other theaters, and we just heard about China this morning. If we were to really invest this amount of our economic resources and military resources in Europe, would China not be celebrating with cartwheels and thinking, boy, this is great, get them focused on Europe, and we can then go and quietly continue to move forward in our quest to rule Asia and the world later. So I want to ask just a little bit about how you think about diplomacy, and then how you think about trade-offs in terms of other theaters where America has deep interests.
Yeah, I mean, I think I can start with the second question. Yes, it is true that America has interests in other parts of the world, but ultimately this is where there's a war actually happening that we are actively sending aid to. And so I think that we have to prioritize what the conflict that is actually occurring. And also, if we are able to send the aid that we produce that we suggest and increase aid, we believe that hopefully this conflict will wrap up pretty quickly, and then we could potentially focus our interests elsewhere. But right now, as there's active fighting in Ukraine, we want to focus our attention there.
And I agree with you that China is watching what's happening in Ukraine very closely. And we want them to get the message that if they carry out an act of aggression, the United States will be resolute in our defense of democracy and of territorial integrity.
Okay. Thank you.
To kind of touch on both of your questions, we think that Russia right now is on the ropes militarily, and they use negotiations right now to stall. And we can see this because Putin is constantly changing what he wants from negotiations. He's kind of negotiating in bad faith. So it's very difficult to rely on Putin's word here, especially because he's using negotiations as a cover to rearm Russia and prepare for a war of attrition, which the U.S. doesn't want to be dragged into. We think that by increasing our pressure now, we can create a lasting peace that allows us to divert more attention to China in the future without having to worry about this. Yeah.
Okay, so since I always ask 3 questions, I'll ask 3 questions. On the overarching issue, you didn't say very much about U.S. interests in the conflict. That's kind of implicit in this idea that we're defending a rules-based international order, and that's an American interest. But I'd be interested to hear you articulate in a little more detail what you think the stakes are for the United States here. One of the primary counter-arguments to U.S. participation, after all, is the argument that our interests aren't centrally engaged. Our European allies are, ours are not. Right? The current presidential administration believes that trade with Europe should largely be supplanted by increased economic activity domestically within the United States, for example. Many people believe that the beating up that Russia has taken so far in the war, as you've articulated it, will prevent them from going any further after this war concludes, and therefore the Russian threat to the rest of Europe is overstated. Anyway, I'd be interested to hear more from you about what you see as the American interest in the conflict that would warrant the degree of increased investment that you propose. Secondly, on the military side of things, you claim that the war is winnable, but as Tammy pointed out, you don't articulate what you mean by win. So let just as a thought experiment, let's assume that with proper U.S. assistance, Ukraine can retake all of the ground in the Donbass and Zaporizhia that you would have them retake. I personally don't think that's possible, but let's stipulate that it is. Why would Putin then stop the war? All Putin would need to keep the war going is to continue an ongoing strategic bombing campaign against Kyiv and other Ukrainian cities that the retaking of Ukrainian ground won't preclude. He'll retain the air bases, he'll retain the aircraft, he'll retain the missiles and the missile launchers. Ukraine can't deny Russia the capacity to continue the war. Retaking all of Ukrainian territory changes the circumstances on the ground, but doesn't necessarily change Putin's incentive to continue, given that many people believe that if he admits defeat in Ukraine, for example, by allowing Ukraine to retake all the territory it has as of February 2022, he would be inviting a coup d'etat. So tell me more about how you think the war can be brought to a successful end when no matter what we do, Putin will retain the option to continue the war if Putin decides it's in Putin's self-interest. So the third question has to do with the economic side of things and the issue of sanctions. So to your credit, you've correctly noted that the primary problem with sanctions so far, other than the fungibility of economic assets within Russia, has been the inability to prevent Russia from trading with people outside the sanction regime. A 500% tariff threat directed at two of our primary trading partners might very well scare our trading partners. If it doesn't, what do we do? If China and India decide that they're not going to give in, can we sustain a 500% tariff regime towards two of our primary trading partners? Is this a threat that we could actually carry out, or is it simply a bluff?
Yeah, I mean, I guess I can start off and address that. We aren't trying to decouple ourselves from the Chinese and Indian economies. We're just trying to target specific or create specific sanctions to incentivize them to stop working with Russia. But as you said, if they were to continue working with Russia and we do use these 500% tariffs, it certainly would be a burden on our economy. But I think we have to pay at some point, and we might as well do so now rather than later. Additionally, we can lean more heavily on our European allies. And as you mentioned earlier, our current administration is trying to produce more things domestically anyways. So in a sense, we would also be aiding that effort.
Okay.
As for the military aspect, if we are in the scenario where these illegally annexed territories have been returned to Ukraine, we expect to create a situation where Russia no longer feels comfortable striking inside of Ukraine, both because of American security assurances to Ukraine and because of the F-16s. The reason that I highlighted the F-16s so heavily is because they give Ukraine the ability to deny Russia offensive operations that will hit Ukraine with the return of territory.
And that leaves me the first question, which is the U.S. interest in the conflict. We think there's no risk of free riding effects because Trump has already negotiated a 5% spending increase to 5% for NATO allies. And we think that there are two central security risks that the U.S. ought to be concerned about in Europe. First is like the continuing ongoing Russian risk that, but more importantly, we think that there's a risk of NATO fragmenting. We've already seen 2 days ago when Russia bombed when Russia bombed Ukraine, Poland sortied out its fighters independently of NATO because they saw themselves as threatened. And this continuing Russian risk risks making European leaders see themselves as like countries responsible for their own defense rather than countries in a coalition. And we think when that happens, there's so much uncertainty that creates, and that throws U.S. hegemony into uncertainty, yeah.
And to add on to that, this is also kind of symbolic. I think that showing that we will protect Ukraine and protect democracies demonstrates to the rest of the world that we are protecting the liberal world order. And I think that if Ukraine doesn't go over well, there's going to be kind of a domino effect, and several other things will fall apart if we don't take care of this how we should.
Thank you.
So first of all, commending our whole team for an excellent presentation and a comprehensive demonstration of your position. So great job. I have a variety of questions. At least in the first tranche here, I will limit myself to the following. So first, Elliot, I think it was you who drew a line between having Ukraine recapture the Donbass, Luhansk, but not Crimea. Mm-hmm. And I was hoping you could walk us through that proverbial line or territorial line. If you're confident that we can have Ukraine go this far, how come not all the way to Crimea? Is that a military calculation? Is that a political calculation? Both, something else? Please illuminate us on your thinking.
Of course.
Secondarily, I was struck by your articulation of the desire to have Ukraine join not just the European Union, but also NATO, right? You are surely aware of the argument that exists that it is NATO's very expansion in the 1990s and into the 2000s that have brought us to the war in Ukraine in the first place. So if we just take that argument on for just a moment, what is the risk in your mind that inclusion of Ukraine in the alliance now wouldn't then precipitate some other action elsewhere, sort of exacerbating the security dilemma that Tammy mentioned earlier this morning? And then last but not least, I think I would love to hear from you what your perceptions are of the American domestic political appetite for, in addition to the 500% tariffs, the memorandum of understanding that you articulated as wanting to model off of the pre-existing U.S.-Israel relationship. I think that has become politically contested over time, and it's not obvious to me that such an organizational structure would necessarily be politically palatable in the U.S. Congress as it exists. So if you could walk us through all of that, I'd appreciate it.
Yeah, of course. To start with the Crimea question, it's primarily military. The Russian military has been in Crimea for a while. We believe that they're very entrenched, and that if Ukraine were to attempt to liberate Crimea, they may risk huge amounts of damage that then would cause the unraveling of all of Ukraine's security. As far as NATO membership goes, we are very open to the idea that perhaps the Clinton administration overplayed their hand with regards to NATO, but that's not really our issue right now. This is the hand that we've been dealt, and we have to play it. We believe that without NATO membership for Ukraine, they will never be safe from Russian aggression. So this is 100% necessary. I don't know if one of you wants to take the domestic side of things.
Yeah, so I mean, adding on to like the second question you raised, we think that like we don't really have a choice in this matter. We've committed to Ukraine, and this commitment has to be upheld. And no matter who started the conflict or what Russia thinks our reasons for continuing the conflict are, the international order is at stake, and our enemies are watching. It's a very crucial moment for upholding the international order. And as for domestic appetite, we think that the U.S. population likes seeing military victory without American casualties, and I think this provides us like the perfect it is a situation in which the U.S. audience has a great appetite for. We think that we're not risking any U.S. servicemen. The Ukrainians are already willing to defend their own country, and we're just supplying them with the weapons and tools to do so.
I have a question I'd like to ask, and I know probably requires some spontaneous thinking, but I think many experts would say you're offering Ukraine EU membership, NATO membership, and you say we're going to support until they get back all 4 of the provinces that Putin has annexed. Let's imagine a scenario where you could get 2 out of those 3 things, which I think many people would say, wow, that's a really great deal. Which one of the 3 big things that you guys are holding out would you be willing to sacrifice, as has been argued, sort of diplomatic process? So is there one of those 3 that you would be willing to make some concessions on?
We might have differing opinions on this.
That's what I was expecting,
but-
if someone would get us started, then
Yeah,
maybe.
I can start. I think I would say probably the land, because ultimately having NATO, as we just discussed, provides Ukraine a long-term security guarantee. And then having EU membership provides it long-term economic guarantee. And so I think that if it has less territory, that wouldn't be ideal, but ultimately the rest of it and the heart of it is still secure.
All right. For what it's worth, I think you made the right choice there.
More questions from our experts?
So I want to hear more about your view of trade and U.S. interests, because I think different parts of the presentation are coming out differently on that issue. On the one hand, the reason we care, I gather, about the health of NATO and the liberal world order is that it promotes international trade, which is presumed to be in an important U.S. interest. And that's been historically the standard fundamental feature of U.S. grand strategy since World War II. On the other hand, we're willing to threaten 500% tariffs to a major trading partner for coercive purposes, which is justified by the argument that we don't need trade. So I'm interested to hear more about, generally speaking, how should we think about the salience of trade as an American interest. In a related issue, Russian assets, I gather, are to be confiscated as a means for rebuilding Ukraine, and certainly this has been proposed. And I'm curious to hear you tell me more about why that hasn't happened yet. There are counter-arguments to this. The counter-arguments are particularly strongly held in Europe, and therefore these frozen assets have not yet been confiscated. Why haven't they been? Are those arguments sound? And why should we believe that on balance they should be confiscated rather than not? And we should talk offline about F-16s. But last but not least, I want to say something I should have said at the beginning, which is I share my colleague's view that this was a very articulate presentation of a very forceful argument. So, bravo on that. And I thought the slide on highway signage was a particularly ingenious way to make the case. You picked a sign for Las Vegas. And I'm wondering if there's a message there about whether you see this as a gamble. Who knows? But
Well, to answer that question, that was a sign for Las Vegas, New Mexico, because I'm from Santa Fe, New Mexico, so that was a highway sign from there. But I guess if you want to read into it a double meaning, we also can do that. And then to respond to your other questions, in terms of trade as an American interest, I think, yes, trade is very important for American interests. I mean, earlier you were mentioning comparative advantage, and I do think that there is a lot of merit to that, and I think it is probably best, even if our current administration doesn't agree with it, that we should try to produce things in other countries and trade them. That said, it also can be used as a very effective tool to try to get things to go our way. And so I think that, yes, the tariffs will have a bit of an economic impact, or more than a bit of an economic impact within the U.S., but I think that ultimately they can still get our point across, and hopefully once the conflict has been taken care of, then we can alleviate those tariffs, and then we can trade more freely with China and India. But also, it's possible that they will see these tariff threats and then back off, and then we don't have to even impose them. In terms of Russian assets, I don't know all the arguments why it hasn't been used already. I think there is some legal questions as to whether that's allowed or not, and it certainly would flare some tempers. But I think that the time to act is now, and maybe we haven't done it yet, but that doesn't mean that we can't do it now, and we can't do it in the future.
Yeah, as for whether this trade position is consistent, we think it is consistent. I think we're making a fairly Hobbesian argument that we're using coercion to uphold freedom. And I think Russia right now is threatening trade. It's threatening economic security in Europe. And I think threatening Russia and allies who abet Russia's actions is consistent with upholding international trade. Yeah.
Real quick, just one from me. Putin has invested greatly in this war. One can argue, certainly, that he probably made a terrible misjudgment about how easy he thought this was going to be. But when he got a real bloody nose from that miscalculation, he did not back down. He doubled down. What makes you think that if you really lean in and create a victory for Ukraine that basically looks like a terrific defeat for Russia and for Putin personally, that he would be willing to just accept it? We talked a little bit last night about humiliation and human reaction and human emotion, and so I'm worrying about this in terms of if Putin survives, it's hard for me to imagine that he's just going to sit back and take this on the chin. What makes you think that he'll do this? Is it that you are convinced that we can lean in so much that he just has no cards left to play, that it'll be overwhelming? Or are there other calculations that you're making about why Putin would simply accept this kind of profound victory for Ukraine?
Putin has been repeatedly testing the resolve of the United States. We've seen this especially since the election, trying to overwhelm Ukrainian air defenses to then see if the United States is willing to take that extra step to allow Ukraine to defend themselves. And yeah, we believe that if we really lean into this, if we commit ourselves aggressively, and in the long term, that Putin will not have a choice. He will be forced either to come to the negotiating table to save face, or we're just going to push the Russians out of Ukraine on the lines that we established. And we aren't interested in giving him a second choice.
I have a question about that second choice. What role do nuclear weapons play here in this conflict?
We need to make it exceptionally clear to the Russians that any use of nuclear weapons, strategic or tactical, will be met with an overwhelming American response. This will be the opening of Pandora's box, and the Russians need to understand that if they do that, we live in a completely different world.
Last quick final point. When you say bringing Putin to the negotiating table, are those negotiations basically accepting your terms? I mean, are there room for negotiations, or is it you will come to a table and agree to everything we've laid out in advance? Is there a give and take, or is there no?
He'll put his name on our piece of paper.
All right, very bold.
There you go.
We have time for one more question from one of our experts.
Let's see.
Do F-16s.
All right, let's.
Take a long time.
Well, we'll do the short version of F-16s then. The F-16 is being retired from the United States Air Force because it's not survivable in modern air defense environments. Right? The way the Ukrainians are using F-16s is well behind the front, mostly to shoot down drones, as you correctly point out. But you're arguing that more F-16s will allow the Ukrainians to establish air superiority. Now, I'm not expecting a full-scale air defense analysis, given the amount of time you've been able to invest in the project. That said, it's a pretty tall claim to argue that an obsolescent airplane, if provided in enough numbers, can establish air superiority in a theater where American pilots with US-level suppression of enemy air defense technology and doctrine don't think they could do it. I'm curious to learn more, I guess, about your remarkable and heartwarming confidence in the F-16 and its apparently amazing capabilities.
But you aren't the only one arguing this. There are many colleagues that we have that have been arguing pro F-16. So.
Yeah, our understanding of Ukrainian air policy right now is that it's based on the limitations of the number of F-16s that they have and the number of pilots that they have to fly them. and that if we can provide them with more pilots and with more planes, that they will be able to get more aggressive with their F-16s.
Yeah, I'd be happy to discuss the F-16s and modern air defense in more detail offline, but I'm color me skeptical, I think.
Team A, you got a question?
So you all seem pretty confident that Ukraine can manage with more U.S. weapons, and you said no troops. How are you confident that this war won't just drag on for 5-10 more years? This is, from our understanding, defense is very favored in this war. So how do you plan or think about pushing through this defensive line? Or we can look to the summer 2023 offensive as kind of like a failure of taking back some of that territory.
Also, to add on to that, we know that currently we've had to stop sending certain types of systems and weapons because it seems the United States stockpiles are low. So how long are you willing to continue that if the United States can't really keep up now?
To start, I don't believe that the answer that we've been given about the recent pause to Ukraine is entirely truthful. I think that we do have the capability to keep supporting Ukraine, and especially with more investment in America's defense industrial base, we will be able to keep this up in the long run.
I think in terms of timeline, in the best case scenario, maybe mid to late 2026, we'd love to wrap this up. As Jason pointed out at the beginning of our presentation, Russia is predicted to run out of tanks and many ammunitions by 2026. And so if we can put pressure on them until that point and through that point, ideally we could wrap up the conflict pretty quickly. But again, we don't know what's going to happen. We don't know if that's going to be the case. So I think we'll just keep going until they fall.
Yeah, all we can say is that the Russians are incredibly weak now. They're using North Korean soldiers, they're using prisoners, and these conscripts aren't being trained to the level of combat effectiveness. And we think that the distinction between now and 2023 is really vast in how far we've come and how degraded the Russian military is now.
So just because we have one more minute, is there a date past which you would give up this strategy? Let's say it's 2030 and the line has not moved. Are you sticking with this strategy indefinitely?
We will have signed an MOU for 10 years to Ukraine, so maybe that would be the point at which we reconsider 2035.
Okay. All right.